Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started just because we're already running 10 minutes late, which is not a good way to start. Welcome everyone to the final plenary session. It's been a very thought-provoking and inspiring couple of days. What we're going to do in this session is really focus on taking in all of the information that you've taken in, the different discussions that you've had in private, maybe questions that you've asked publicly in the presentations you've heard, and try and see if we can put it into an idea, some practical ideas around change. So we're working with the idea of what is needed to promote change, both in policy and in research. What are the agendas that we need to think about taking forward? So the way that we're going to do this is we've got 5 speakers, 5, yes, who are each going to talk to you for about 5 to 7, 8 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, we'll see how it goes, on what they feel are some of the most important things from their work, from their perspective, and from the discussions they've had over the past couple of days. And then we're going to turn it over to you to put forward suggestions, comments, questions, anything that you think that we can use to take forward and to move this from being a 2-day conference into being something that actually starts to change the situation in Sweden and back in your home countries. Okay, so you probably know everyone here. I'll maybe get when you come up if you just, again, say your name maybe and where you're from. And so first up we're going to have Anastasia. Yeah? Okay, great.
Okay. Hello again. So, I said this morning that I'm not going to discuss recommendations, and I guess the first thing I want to say is that we heard a number of very interesting ideas about how to tackle crime on transit, how to maybe help diminish fear. And one of the first things I want to say is that we really have to think into multiple approaches, that it is not a one-size-fits-all, different contexts, different types of crime. And so we have to start thinking about a multi-pronged approach. I'm going to talk a little bit about 4 prongs, and there is certainly a 5th one that I'm sure people here have already started talking about it, which is education. But I would like to start, the 4 prongs that I would like to talk about are research, design, transport policy, and transport technology, because I think each one of them has something to offer, and sometimes we have to do things a little bit different. So maybe we can change the slide because this doesn't work. Perfect. So there is a lot of research around mobility, and thankfully we started seeing more studies in the last 10 years about gender issues, and I think this is very important. At the same time, again, being female, there are so many other nuances, right? So it is not only female versus male, but older females versus younger females, females of different culture as compared to some of the dominant cultures in particular countries. So issues of class, issues of age, issues of sexual orientation, all these play a role and may generate more fear, less fear, etc. So we really need to, when we study as researchers, we really need to be aware of these issues and try, especially some of the less studied groups and less studied contexts. For example, in the US, one context that is less studied is the rural context. We don't have much information. Also, develop appropriate methodologies for data collection. I'm working very recently, I have been working with older, low-income, minority adults, older adults in inner city of Los Angeles, and it is very clear one of the the best data collection was to take them around the block and have them talk about the experiences that, and actually Mari Brosen, who is here, is part of this work as well. So we took older adults around the block, and they told us all the challenges they are facing walking. And this was much better than other methodologies. So kind of enrich the methodologies as researchers. Cast light on unexplored issues and settings And as I mentioned, understand the transportation needs of different subgroups. The transportation needs of this group of older adults was extremely different by the fact that they were older, they were low income, and they were living in the inner city. They were different from the same age adults living in the suburbs. They were different from the same age adults that have more options, et cetera, et cetera. And the other thing that we're facing as researchers is quite often we're very happy to publish. It is part of a reward system, the best impact factor journals, et cetera. But what we're finding, we should not assume that always is revealed to practitioners. And so having more of these practitioner academic dialogues for the researchers to understand some of the issues, for the practitioners to get to know some more of this research. And I think the onus is more on the researchers, frankly, than the practitioners to let their findings be known. So let's go to the next. My background is from architecture. I have a lot of faith in the design of the built form and how it can help make less aggravating certain situations. Again, I'm not a physical determinist. I don't believe that we can solve everything by design. But design of urban form in ways that enhances access to neighborhood amenities, in ways that shortens trip length, mixed land uses that bring more people on the streets and the sidewalks, concentration of different land uses at particular nodal points, childcare closer to home. Transportation agencies have now started discussing finally the first and last mile connections. How do you enhance walkability? How do you place bus stops near people and activity and in ways that allow natural surveillance? We talked a bit about lighting, but even the design of the bus stop, again, to use the example of that older group of adults that I have been working with, it became clear that their fear was how, they had many different fears, but one fear was, how do I get on the bus when the bus stops that far from the curb? And it is a process. They were afraid about the intersections that are so wide that the light turns red in the middle of the intersection. And this was diminishing their walkability, was making them stay home instead of really walking for physical exercise or even to reach certain destinations. And that leads to social isolation and very diminished mobility. So these are some of these issues. Some of these issues can be resolved through design. I mean, to think about how do you create the entrance to the bus that really better bridges the gap. Of course, a number of buses deploy ramps, but a lot of them said, well, I'm embarrassed to ask for the ramp because everybody starts kind of looking at us and sending us dirty looks because we're delaying the whole process. So all this to say that there are certain design ideas and design solutions that can make things easier. Let's go to my third prong, which is transport policy. And we really need to have, and we had a discussion earlier about decision-making and about how women are not really getting very much involved in the decision-making processes. Now, in many countries, women are almost in the same numbers in the labor force. And we really need to push more for women-friendly transport policies. This is better done, I think, in the UK, probably in Sweden. They have gender mainstreaming policies. Women are the best advocates for themselves because they really know what their needs are. And so I think we really need more women. We had a panel, I was part of a panel a couple of years ago of women who were leaders of certain transportation agencies. And I got quite frustrated because they were talking about how their responsibility is to respond to the universal needs of their clients. And this is really a big fallacy. There are no universal, of course, we all have the same needs. We all need to feel safe. But there are specific needs that different people have. So if you do not see those, this starts creating a problem. So I think inclusion of women's voices in policy development, development of safety audits. We have Caroline, she probably can say a few things. She's an expert on that. It started in Canada years ago, looking into whole journey approach. That's another term that has become important. These, I hope, are not simply terms, but would be incorporated more and more in the transportation policy, because it's only then that we can see, a kind of a safer travel, women feeling better in terms of using public transit. And let's go to my fourth prong, which is the next slide. And we also live in kind of an era where technology is changing fast. And we talked about how a number of systems have now started incorporating real-time information. You talked about the apps, and there is a lot that can be done through apps. The CCTV, I put 2 question marks, because at least with women I have talked to, they're a bit concerned that quite often the police finds after the effect, if a crime happens, it may help them find who the perpetrator was or the criminal, but as one told me, who helps me the time that I'm being victimized? There is this new autonomous vehicles, car sharing, bicycle sharing, driverless cars. I think we really need to try to identify which are the liberating aspects of technology in terms of enhancing the situation of mobility, lessening the fear, and how can we take advantage of them, and which aspects of technology may lead towards problems. And I think that's something that, we have just started thinking about it, but still I predict that it is going to occupy a lot of us, a lot of in the near future. So these are my notes, and I want to yield the floor. Thank you. Thank you.
So no, I don't have a presentation for this. So most of you heard me yesterday. We've been speaking for 2 days on crime and fear in public spaces, what women go through in their daily lives when they are using the metro, going to a public space, passing through a park, going to buy vegetables. Every experience that they go through is almost underlined with anxiety, because they don't know when they are going to face sexual violence in public space. So what does it do? What does crime do? What does the fear of being victimized do to somebody who is trying to lead a normal life of going to school, college, or workspace, coming here for this, this conference? So 50% of the population is living with fear. Just thinking about that will give you an idea what this world is actually doing to their own people, right? So there are psychological effects. Families try to tell their women and girls to not go out. Children are restricted to home. Women have more or less, a lot of research has said that women more or less try to change and adapt themselves to how the world wants them to be. So they take different routes to work or school or college. They probably don't go out after a certain time in the day. You have more restrictions on women and girls accessing public spaces after a point. So it is in effect saying that women should not be out living a normal life after a particular point. So probably you won't see women outside after a point. You'll probably only see men. So we'll probably be going back to the time when men went out to earn the bread and women were at home and taking care of rearing kids and making food. Right? But we don't want that. We are progressive. We don't want that. We are trying to look for a solution. So it's not any one particular solution, I think, that we can talk about and we can work on. I think every stakeholder, every person who lives on this planet has a role to play. So we start with the government. We all have laws. The countries have laws. There are enough systems in place. But the government needs to make sure that they are women-friendly. Like you rightly said, women need to be on panels who decide policies because they are actually 50% of the population who are going to utilize the benefits of those policies. The government needs to make more human-centric systems and needs to ensure that all the administration which is supposed to be implementing those are actually stringently implementing them. We need to have urban planning majorly working on how they can have human-centric, gender-friendly infrastructures. Eyes on the road is a very simple thing that people can do. I mean, I was walking through yesterday with my friend, and I was telling her, you know, I love looking at Europe and sometimes the buildings they have, because they actually have houses and windows which are at eye level of the street, and I could see people moving inside, and it makes me feel safe when I walk through even at 10 o'clock in the night from KTH to my hotel. So that's a very simple form of how infrastructure can help you feel safe. Places like flyovers or you know, huge isolated areas, I mean, can you probably lit them well so that women don't feel as isolated and vulnerable? You could have SOS numbers which are placed everywhere that women can just need to dial, not remember a number to dial on the phone and answer 20 questions before somebody comes. So these are small things that urban planners can do and the government can actually implement in its system of how the city is planned. I think as a community, as people who are rearing these people who will sit on these policy panels tomorrow, who will obviously be making part of this administration, we need to rear our kids with more gender equal education. I think that's one of the most essential part, because whatever we do, we are growing up with a certain imprint in our head. We are being labeled. And we grow up to understand that's the right way of behaving. So education of children is very important. Boys need to be educated to respect and value other genders, to understand consent, to understand what is private and valuable to you is also private and valuable to somebody else. So I think child education and boy education is extremely important in this. So obviously the sex education, incorporating that in schools is extremely important. We are fighting for that in India. I think some countries do have it under extremely glossy names which don't call it sex education and all. I think other countries do have some form of that education as well. So those are the few things that we need to do. We need to definitely stop thinking that the government's going to do everything, or the police will do everything. I think somewhere we also need to be responsible for what we want. Like they say, be the change that you want to see. So as citizens, I think we need to be active bystanders. We need to be active in voicing what we want to the concerned government or the concerned administration. And we have noticed in all the work that we have done that when we stand up and say that we want this change or this is not being done properly, the government actually does it. So a very simple example, we do safety audits where we walk through areas with the residents and we mark points and areas which they feel are vulnerable or not properly lit or something. And there are a lot of these lampposts which are there. And so some of them were not lit and we said, okay, there's a number on the lamp. Did you know that? The lamppost has a number. They said, no. So write it down. And there's a number where you can call the municipal corporation and tell them this particular lamppost is not lit. 48 hours, the lamppost was lit. And we've seen this in India. If it happens in India, I'm sure it happens anywhere in the world. So citizens need to be, I think, a little bit more proactive in what they want changed in their life. That's extremely important. Like Mahesh said in the morning, I think media plays a very important role in a lot of countries, especially India, where Bollywood is so big. We have heroes stalking heroines, and eventually the heroine agrees to be with him, and that's sending out a message that stalking is okay. A man is writing letters in blood, and he gains sympathy because he's probably the Salman Khan of India Bollywood, and eventually he gets the girl, and people think that's the right thing to do. So I think media needs to be much more responsible. That's one of the biggest and the most impactful form of education we have for children, for youth, and for other people. So media needs to be extremely, extremely responsible. I think that more or less includes almost everyone, right? I think I included all the stakeholders probably. And I definitely feel that as a community, as researchers, as people who are working with the communities on the ground, we all need to consolidate whatever learnings we have, whatever work we are doing on one platform so that we can quicken the process of seeing a change. We all work in isolated places, but if we can all come together and have one platform, I think there's so much that we can do much, much faster. So yes, I would like to leave it with that. That's more or less.
Yeah, Mr. UN bureaucracy. Okay. I guess the issue is more about the recommendations we are making for what research outcomes we have presented at this particular session. And I think I will try to contextualize my recommendations in four main broad themes: knowledge, learning, innovation, and integrated solutions. I say this with a dimension of looking at not just what we call research, but call embedded research. Meaning, I think what we need to now begin to focus more is to the extent that our research informs the practice that cities are actually taking up and advancing on addressing the individual's rights to safe public places. So what I've heard in this has been amazing methodologies that have been developed and tested around this particular theme. But I have seldom heard of how this is connected to the way cities themselves are turning all this into practice. And that's just where it happens. So I think we need to bridge the gap between research and practice and begin to see how our research informs in a very broad way the definition of policies in what, in fact, back to the basics, what policy describes as public space or public place. Sometimes we use these terms running over them to mean the same, but they actually are not the same. So does it apply to the questions of crime and violence that are informed by constructs of knowledge and theories that are differentiated. And so key in terms of knowledge, I think we need a broad definition of what we really mean by safe public places and how we integrate this into the broad urban strategies and interventions that cities are actually implementing. One. Two, I would also suggest that we look at we review the institutionalization of these areas of what we are describing as individuals' rights, the rights to the city, how the dimension of cities for all plays out in the context of city governance. It's good for us to use tools like the safety audits and suggest a notion that we're engaging communities to make the change. But to what extent are these models that we are developing at the community level connected to the way cities function, just in the basic planning and design processes? This is an arena, I think, that has been very little documented. We don't have much documentary evidence, even where it is working. We seem not to have the evidence to really encourage this type of methodologies to then take root in the way cities are functioning. So we need really to connect the cities with these inspiring sources of knowledge to inform effective responses. They say, for example, that a safe city for women is a safe city for all. Now, in practice, what does this mean for a planner in a city looking at the way the transport system is running? How do they use this powerful narrative to transform the way we look at cities for women? From a connectivity, in how we plan in advance, how we plan for social integration, how we plan for connectivity, and how we plan at human scale. So I really want to emphasize that the documentary evidence around this is very shallow, and we continue to build rich knowledge at the community level about what we can do to engage citizens, to influence the way they shape place and space, but there needs to be more embedded research. Now, in terms of learning, I would say we need to take lift this knowledge to a perspective where we look at cities as human creations, which they are. And so the possibility of redesigning cities away from sprawl to be more compact, to think about the whole aspect of walkability as probably the drive that helps us bring the safety realities into a more measurable perspective of the delivery of safety. So a city that is walkable should then espouse ideals that really allow for human interaction and exchange, for those attributes that we have spoken to with respect to women's safety, what we really need to really encompass around neighborhood, open spaces with this notion of walkability. I think we need to look at the dimension of how cities, how universities connect their work, again, with cities, looking at cities as laboratories. I think this is something we can all do in our respective universities to start developing beyond studios the perspective of safety labs, and where we build in other actors that are not necessarily planners, other disciplines that are not necessarily within our realm, to encourage this co-production notion and then link the local governments to these laboratories where embedded research works to inform practice. The element of innovation, I would encourage us to translate this to indicators that incentivize new action-oriented interventions by different stakeholders at a neighborhood level. Looking at the inspiration of a city like Rotterdam that has developed what we call the Neighborhood Safety Index, to use that as a basis to monitor on an annual basis the type of transformations that are happening at a neighborhood level, is what we could also think of as an organizing framework around this topical area of safe public places, and see this as a tool that can encourage the type of actions that we need. Of course, we can link this with technology and use technology that is people-centered. Look at how, for example, the safety audits have been translated into mobile technology, using mobile technology into acts like My Safe City app, and see how such data that is gathered from this type of apps connects to the way cities own and store this data and translate to interventions on the ground. And then I think the whole question of linking in terms of integrated solutions, safety audits with place audits. I think we need to try and find a way of how place audits that have actually led to models of place governance, like the community management boards in New York, can translate and link the work the beautiful work that's coming out of safety audits into the realities of how communities manage and govern their spaces. I think that's in a nutshell. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank Vanya for giving the opportunity of this particular panel, because normally we don't get to kind of reflect upon the conference. But thanks for giving that opportunity. I didn't prepare any slides. I'll just mention a few anecdotes, and I'll talk about my own role, what I take from this and what I can do, and then just a major policy recommendation, which I touched upon earlier in my presentation. A couple of random thoughts. In my head, it's very clear they're all connected, but for you, it's like, what the hell is he talking about? Okay? Bear with me. When I travel to India and speak with some of my friends they rarely ever ask me what I do, because they don't understand what criminal justice is. I'm not a physicist, I'm not a statistician, I'm not a mathematician. But criminal justice, no one understands what that is in India. So what is that? And so nobody asks me what I do. But on recent occasions, when people asked me and I told them about this research that I'm doing, the most often the reaction I would get is that, oh, so you have gone over to the other side. You go to America and then you come back and preach us about how bad India is. So I think they've done a wonderful job in trying to make you what you are, a very cynical approach. It's just a random anecdote. The second observation is that I don't think you guys really understand, because you are often in privileged positions. You never have women in your households actually face victimization, the kind of victimization that's fairly seen in ordinary life. And a regular, ordinary life is so far removed from the privileged lives you lead. You know, the women in your household, you know, your wife, sisters, children, they're chauffeur-driven, dropped off at point A to point B, picked up. So in that sense, you may not really grapple with the problem, the extent of the problem. Sure, that's a second point, unconnected yet. The third point is, when I was doing domestic violence research in India, there used to be a very popular Hindi serial or soap. It used to, in translation, it would be, the mother-in-law was once a daughter-in-law. What it actually talks about is that there's a cycle of transmission, just like cycle of violence we talk about. There is perpetration of violence, domestic violence. Not that the show was talking about domestic violence, but it kind of portrays and epitomizes what actually happens in most people's lives. Even though they are wearing, you know, $1,000 saris for each shot that they're actually being picturized for the episode. But the point is that it happens in everybody's life, most often. So that's again, a symbolism for the cycle of cultural transmission of values and ideas. And the fourth point that actually hit me very hard is Anastasia's comment about, you know, what we do for our lives. And when we work in universities, there is certain expectations, but you're also not kind of rewarded for doing what we ought to be doing. This was actually reflected, you know, in recent years when my wife, who's a Facebook user, I don't use Facebook, but she put on her Facebook saying, oh, I finally realized people read Mahesh's research. And what it was that Vanya did a special issue on violence and sexual harassment in public spaces. And for some reason, that article got picked up over 80 websites and in 30 different countries, talking about sexual harassment. So it hit me that, oh, okay, so maybe there's a way to reach the audiences for communicating the kinds of issues in ways that kind of sensitizes people. So again, these are all kind of random thoughts. What I'm trying to bring it together is a couple of things. From my side, I feel from what I learned in the last 2 days is that, again, I acknowledge my limitations with the research, but it became even more apparent. The research that I have presented here requires a tremendous amount of refinement, because I was coding my offenders as yes or no to 20 different behaviors. And they're not all the same. Whistling is not the same as poking someone from behind, or groping, or pulling their hair. These are very qualitatively different experiences. So what it needs is that, the sample frame should be large enough to kind of isolate individual kinds of behaviors. Perhaps they do what the little we found was that there are differences between verbal, nonverbal, and more serious kinds of offenses. So what that means is that refinement of research. So from the personal point of view, I see that that's a need that I have to expend some energy in picking up this research and hustling for money to support the research. The second thing is that I've used 4 or 5 different cabs in Stockholm. They are either from Iran, Kurdistan, or some other place that seems to have exposure to Bollywood movies. That's the only thing they asked me. Oh, we like Indian food and we watch Bollywood movies. And one guy even delivered a dialogue from a movie that came in 1970s, a very popular movie called Sholay. Some of the Indian audiences understand and recognize this movie. The fact is that this man is either 45, 50 years old, but he still kind of revels in that the impact that he had experienced watching these movies. So you can just imagine what it does to billions of people whose livelihood or actually only entertainment is watching movies in theaters. And it's tremendous. And so I echo with you in that sense that, I mentioned briefly in my presentation, but we don't know how well to use media to communicate these messages and what role that they would play. At least for India, I think they would play a very, very critical role. Get Sachin Tendulkar, who's like the god of cricket in India, and have him do, involve him in this kind of communicating this message. So that's, again, the short-term things. Another short-term thing I could think of is that based on what my wife told me, and then again, interestingly, people who went on Facebook, she showed me, there were a lot of criticisms about me that came from very educated people on the Facebook, echoing that, oh, he has no respect for Indian culture. He goes to America and then publishes stuff like this, putting India in bad light. These are educated people. So it goes back to this culture of the resistance and what needs to be done to penetrate that. And op-eds. And so I realized from that experience, I must write more of these short pieces that tailor it to how media can actually use this to publish them, to sensitize, to have. So I'm developing contacts in Times of India, NDTV, which is like a CNN news network for India. So those are the short-term attempts that I could think of, trying to communicate what I'm good at. I can only speak about what I can do and what I'm good at. And then in the long range, I think one last thing is that I mentioned about curriculum changes, and I do believe that it happens either for good or bad, and depending on what the objective of that particular curriculum development is. We talked about it. When you introduce in preschool, it doesn't have to be, in the context of the vocabulary is the key, and how you direct that. It's not in the context of sexual harassment, gender violence, but mostly in the context of, equality, right to public spaces and sharing and dignity, human dignity, and so. These could be, again, I'm not a specialist in that area, in framing and couching those kinds of things, but the idea is that it's still, you start early. And one of the common things I hear from parents in the US, particularly coming from China, Korea, and India, is that, oh, we thought our kids would go over to the other side, coming to America and living in America. But funny thing happened. When they turned around 21, 22, we were shocked to see how good a job we did as parents teaching them with the values that we believed in. They did a full circle. We thought that they'd become monsters when they're 16, 17, 18 years old because completely out of control. But something happened to them. It's a long-range thing. It's a full circle. They come back. But the idea is that what you sow is what you reap. And so initial investments in early childhood curriculum development and bringing a larger, like incorporating, Supreet said that incorporating parents in some of these programs kind of goes a long way. So these are some closing thoughts and reflections based on this two-day conference. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hugo Darbois de Jubinville. I'm a research officer at the French Observatory of Crime and Criminal Justice. I'm mostly working on perceptions of safety and transit safety, and Vanya has kindly asked me to participate in this debate to talk about what's needed to promote change in France in transit safety. I'm a little bit nervous to talk after Anastasia Lukaitis-Sideris, who is a big superstar in transit safety. So, yeah, a little bit nervous. I don't have the pretension of telling you what is needed or what is the best measure to improve safety in public places. I just want to give you an overview of what is going right now in France concerning the struggle against sexual violence and harassment in public transport. It has become a major public issue since 2015 when a report was published and stating that 100% of women have experienced sexual harassment in public transport once in their lifetime. The problem with this report was that it was obtained through really biased methodology. But nevertheless, it was discussed a lot in the media and in the public, and it helped to put the spotlight on sexual violence in public transport, which is a big issue in France right now. And transit agencies since 2015, 2016 are developing a new measure in public transport. It's not new in other countries, but it's new in France. It's on-demand stops in bus at night. It means users are allowed to ask the driver to stop the bus between two formal stops. It was primarily designed for women, but in the end, transit agencies are declaring that every user who feels unsafe or vulnerable in public transport in buses at night can ask the driver to stop the bus. The idea is to reduce walking distance from the stops to your final destination, usually your home, in order to minimize perceived unsafety during the walk from the bus stop, and to reduce the risk of victimization. So it's quite a simple measure that is being developed right now in France by transit agencies, yeah, a kind of measure primarily targeted for for a particular group of users, in this case women, but that can benefit to all users in the end. Now, you could legitimately say that this is only about the bus, this is only about the night, this does not address sexual violence or unsafety during rush hours in subways, for instance. And also, this is not addressing the deep roots, the deep causes of sexual violence against women. And that's why transit agencies and the government are trying to challenge our society's tolerance for violence against women by developing more and more since 2015 awareness campaigns such as this one that you can see. And you can, if you can just change the slides. Okay, yeah. So you can see that there is a real problem in these awareness campaigns trying to raise awareness about sexual harassment. I can't see sexual harassment. I just see women and animals. I merely see public transport. There is a railway, but it is really difficult to see sexual harassment in those campaigns, okay? In France, we have this big issue of transit agencies and the government being extremely reluctant to picture and show harassers as men. But the reality is that men are harassing women in public transport and transit agencies, and the governments are unable to picture this. So, of course, I know this is a campaign about sexual harassment, so I can think about it and say, okay, the shark over here is a male harasser, but it is not directly shown, and this is a problem. Hopefully it has changed in this month of October, where there are new awareness campaigns about sexual violence in transport, trying to increase bystander interventions. And in this campaign, you can finally see a man harassing a woman, even if it's not really clear in the video developed by the government. So awareness campaigns are not new measures, but they are conducted right now in a new way in France, and they are trying to increase, they are targeted to victims in order to increase reporting and inform victims about their rights, about sexual violence and about reporting, because reporting is very low in France. It is estimated that around 10% of rape victims actually file a formal complaint to the police when they are victimized. Campaigns are also directed at bystanders and other users, so they are more likely to intervene when they are witnessing a situation of sexual harassment. And in this sense, it is going in the way that Suprit talked about, that is increasing proactive bystander intervention. And there is also a shift in awareness campaigns in France that are trying to shift the blame from the victim to the offender, and saying that the victims are not responsible for being attacked or assaulted in public transport or in public spaces in general, but it is the only responsibility of the offender, and offender should be blamed primarily, and no other people should be blamed, especially not the victim. The problem is, and it is something that should be investigated by researchers, we don't know if it works, because the government and transit agencies are not publishing any evaluation reports of these measures. So we don't know if they work, we don't know if they don't work, and we don't know the mechanism that could make those campaigns or those measures successful or failures. So I think this is the direction in which researchers should focus in the following months and years in France, but also abroad, is that asking the government, asking transit agencies, asking the police to give them data and to be able to evaluate those measures. The last awareness campaign developed by the government is now costing 4 million euros for 4 TV spots that are lasting 30 seconds. So we need to know if this investment is worth it. We need to know if those campaigns are going to work or not, and the government should be responsible for providing data allowing rigorous and transparent evaluation of those measures. And I think that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Everyone, just before we're going to go to questions, should we do questions first and then you, Caroline, or do you want to come before? We'll see. Just before, I just want to summarise, I guess, what I picked up from the discussion, because I saw that I came out with 3 kind of themes that really worked across what everyone was saying, which was quite interesting. I thought the first one was something about accessibility, both in terms of urban and transit design, and about walkability around cities and from transit to home, that kind of thing. But also accessibility in research and the importance of us making our research accessible to communities, to cities, to people, to be able to help them pick up and use, what we're thinking. Something else across everybody around the need for a gendered approach, about that approach needing to be women-centred. In design, you need to involve women in design of cities, obviously. That idea of safe for women, safe for all, and also, I think what Anastasia was saying, the importance of us thinking safe for which women, and thinking about the importance of women being located in different positions in relation to other women. Need for women's voices in law and policy, gender mainstreaming. Also, that the research around this area needs to focus on gender and think about the gendered differences and impact. And the last point that you were saying, Hugo, I thought that was really interesting about, there's something there about making men as a problem visible and how easy it is to make the environment the problem or design the problem or animals the problem and not actually making the men who are doing this visible and thinking about how they're using the environment as a resource, but the problem isn't actually lying in the environment, it's lying in the motivations and intentions of some men. In one of the first talks that I was at, they were saying, don't blame the bushes, which I really liked. I hadn't heard that before. And then the last one I thought was around connection and interaction, which works because all 3 of these are connected. They're not going to work in isolation. But the idea, Serpreet's idea about bringing work together on one platform or something, connecting and integrating. What Yuma was saying about connecting cities to knowledge, universities to cities. But also across different speakers about the idea of connecting humans to cities and humans to each other and the interactions of humans, and how I've heard across the day different people talking about how having humans in public spaces make other humans feel safer, which should just make sense, but it doesn't. It's absent a lot of the time, particularly again when we focus on the environment. So how we design cities in that compact way that Yuma was talking about, so there is walkability, so there's more people on the streets, so we're not in cars separate or in taxis separate, we're mingling together. And then also, again, what Serpreet was saying about the role of citizens, the role of bystanders, the role of education, the role of media, the individuals also have a role to play. So that was my kind of summary. What we're going to do now maybe is we have about 10 minutes for some questions, 10, 15 minutes for your questions and comments. Then we're going to go to Caroline for some closing comments on the whole conference, and then end with the wonderful Vanya, who's organised the whole thing for us. Okay, so first questions, I guess, or thoughts, or anything that you're sitting with that you're going to ponder on the walk home. No thoughts. Anything? Yeah.
I have two thoughts, truly. One of them is hearing you all between the flowers. And I think that we should say that our investigations should go through intersectionality. And I think we should have also worries about defining differences between mobility in these different cities that we show here, the size, population, and how it is organized, and all of these things. I think there are two cross things that are very important to focus. Also to think policies, because I agree that we have to use university also to incentivize policies, walkability, other forms of using the city.
Does anyone want to respond? Yeah.
everything you said. And I want to also say something, that we call this, women and safety.
Microphone, please.
But it should not be perceived only as, women's issues, because women are someone's mother, grandmother, loved one, partner, right? And so this is something that affects everyone. It affects others too. It's not only women. So I think that, I hope in the future we would not feel the need even to call this, a women's issue. Everything we need to understand that this affects everyone. And the other thing I was thinking as I was really listening, the other thing I thought was, I think rightly we say, serious crime and not so serious crime, but that also makes us think some of the not so serious crime is also important, because it really makes mobility so much more difficult for, a number of people. So to kind of dismiss some of these, the catcalling, the stalking, as not so serious crime, or as, unfortunately, I'm sure you followed what has been going on in the US with a particular judge, or to say that, this happened so many years ago, boys will be boys, and we don't pay attention to that. That's also a huge disservice, and I would say not only to women, but to families, to people who love women. So that's my 2 cents.
And I would clarify this and add to Anastasia's comment about the seriousness, is that it's critical to understand what factors determine certain behaviors versus others. Not so much in the context of serious or unserious. They're all serious behavior. Behavior, a violation is a serious thing, irrespective of what that is. However, why is it we find some differences for certain kinds of behaviors versus other kinds of behaviors? They don't show up across the board. And so that's an interesting research question. And that's what we need to pursue. Not so much as policy, but mostly in the context of categorizations of behaviors and developing new categories. Because not all theft is the same, and not all crime is the same, and we tend to distinguish, we make categories for right reasons or wrong reasons. So in that sense, I think from a research point of view, they're all equal. We begin with equal, but what could be the differences is what I think I want to emphasize.
So, this is a little away from what was going on. I know everything sounds very bleak and dark while we've been talking about this, and India in particular comes out. We've spoken about India so much. So I must tell you, it's a very exciting time for Indians because the Supreme Court and the government is making a difference in making the place a better place for women. So I'll tell you about 3 things which happened over the past 2 months, which are great. We got to get the tax on sanitary pads removed. So there's no tax anymore in India. I think that's brilliant. So the Supreme Court repealed 377, which is basically same-gender sex is no more a crime in India, which is a big thing for India. So I think we are progressing. Thirdly, Me Too has become extremely big in India over the last 10 days, and so many names are coming up. Unfortunately, I know some of the names which have come up as well, but the government has actually, Supreme Court has set up a committee which is going to sit and take care of these Me Too cases on first come, first serve basis, and they're going to take it to a conclusion over the next 3 months, that's 90 days. So I think for India, things are changing, and I think we all, if we can do whatever we are talking about, I think the future seems pretty bright and sunny. Yeah. But I have a question for all of you. What are you going to do when you go back? You heard so much. What's your contribution? I think there's somebody who's...
I think it was not super easy for us to hear all this research that has been happening the last 2 days. Part of it was quite difficult to digest. And having these conferences doesn't mean that we didn't know it before, but we kind of need to be reminded. Or I would say that we ignore if we want to ignore. And that's
Yeah, I think that's also probably because we had only 2 days. But you're right, we need to also focus on the positives. So I'm sure a lot of you have something positive too. Yes, you have a question, sir.
I would like to hear your thoughts about gender separation as a mean to stop these crimes. In Sweden, in some municipalities, there's a big discussion about separating genders. Swimming arenas, music festivals, and that's one way to block the perpetrator accessing the victim. What's your thoughts?
Schmidt?
I can only tell you what I find US women saying, and there is very mixed, they're very skeptical about that, although they do recognize that they work in certain places, and actually we have, not only in India, but in Mexico City, in Japan, we have, they would like to see options, so for example, the idea of maybe ordering a taxi by a woman driver, that's fine, but there is, they showed quite a lot of skepticism if that really would lead to more discrimination, frankly. So that's what I heard from American women, but I don't know what...
So that's true. I think that's not a sustainable solution. We live together, men and women. We are sitting together here. If you were to imagine have only men here, only women here, I mean, where are we going, right? So it's a very short-term solution for places which are seeing rampant harassment and victimization. But in the long term, I don't think that is something that we should, as people, even ask for from our governments.
Can I say something on that? I also think there's something, if we're thinking about the effect of sexual harassment being reduces women's space, what segregated spaces do again is just reduce women's space. So again, in London, it was suggested about women-only tube carriages, but the tube in London is packed. And if you're a woman and you have to go either on the women-only tube carriage, which is only ever going to be one of a 12-carriage train, your space is reduced. You can't choose to go on the other ones, because if you go on the other ones, you're going to be more blamed because why weren't you in the women-only carriage? So I think it creates, it starts from the wrong place. If we start from the place that we need to stop women's freedom being restricted, then we start to think of solutions that are about how do we expand women's freedom rather than how do we pull it in. Probably got time for one more. Oh, now you all want questions. So always happens. Can we have one more? Has everyone got something burning? You can always talk to people afterwards as well. Okay, one more, yeah.
So, in terms of the way forward, there's kind of two camps here, right? There's people that are talking about the design, the physical environment. And my challenge to that group is that we're talking about public places that change very quickly over time. Transport's one example. So how do we design places that move with the changing dynamics of the place? And then we have the education, which is obviously a more long-term solution. And obviously there's challenges within that for people to talk about. And then thirdly, how do we get these two people to talk a bit more? So when you're designing your solution, is there an educational message around we're having to change the lighting because people are fearing this? And vice versa. So I think that's my kind of challenge to what I've heard.
Anyone like to speak to that?
I can respond to the first part about the design. How do you design fastly changing spaces? Well, first of all, I think we find that transit crime is often highly concentrated. So to give you an idea, there are 19,000 bus stops in Los Angeles, and the vast majority of the bus stop crime is happening in very specific areas. So you really first, as a transit operator who is interested in redesigning bus stops, you have to really look into these bus stops. Not every bus stop, most of the bus stops are completely safe and we don't need to do anything. But we're talking about simple improvements that have to do with, well, first of all, the location of the bus stop, where you locate it. You can move the bus stop quite easily up or down the block if, it is in front of an area that is completely blocked and there are no views. You can put lighting. So these are not huge improvements. You don't need much to retrofit a bus stop, especially if you're not going to retrofit 19,000 bus stops, but we're talking about, 150 probably. So I don't see this as a big issue.
But then moving at a rush hour.
What?
If the rush hour is a problem because it's pickpocketing or it's sexual harassment because it's rush hour and it's too many people,
Yes, and there are also some designs about how do you create, so to avoid pickpockets or sexual harassment where people are really in a linear way waiting for the bus, so you can put some railings. So there are design approaches that you can try to minimize the effect of everybody. We saw a slide, I think from India, where everybody was trying to get up so that you create a more orderly queue. So there are some design ideas about that. You seem skeptical, but...
I just wonder, but then when it's quiet, these things are in the way to get on. That dynamicness of it.
Yeah, well, you have to make some choices, apparently.
Okay, we might just have to move on. I'm just going to pass over to Caroline, who's going to give us some closing. Sum up the whole conference, please, Caroline.
Yeah, as we say in Australian, no worries. Look, I'm going to start out with a quote which most of you probably know. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has, which Margaret Mead said many years ago. About 30 years ago, at about this time of year, actually, in Toronto, there was a bunch of women who were working, that went out a bunch of evenings and asked a bunch of questions around Toronto's 50 subway stations. And I want to pay particular tribute to Reggie Modlik, who died last month, who taught at York University and engaged a bunch of students, including me, also founded Women Plan Toronto and Women in Environments magazine. And the amazing thing, and we thought it was so easy 30 years ago, was that the Toronto Transit Commission listened and created priority waiting spaces at train stations, request stops for buses, including safety concerns in the design of new stations. So fast forward 30 years and everything's solved, right? But the really amazing thing was the analysis then, which was a minority analysis, I think is becoming a majority analysis. The analysis was that the role of institutions wasn't to protect us or to tell us what to do. The role of institutions was to listen, to respect us, and to respond appropriately to our concerns. 30 years ago when I was a student, the question was, why are women so irrational? Why do we fear crime in public space? We know the problems at home and that there isn't much crime in public space. But as Reggie would say a lot, we have the right to be crazy. The world's a pretty crazy place. We still are doing all that safety work that Fiona spoke about. Don't be distracted by your phone. No, carry your phone all the time and send texts to people. Don't make eye contact. No, do make eye contact and be confident. It's crazy contradictory messages, and it's not our job. I remember the immense sense of relief I had when I first heard about the term everyday violence. And that's what we've been talking about a lot over the past couple of days, everyday violence in public space as a barrier to the right to safety. The right to be public women and men, as both Jenny and Liz spoke about, to be in public space alone, empowered, and unafraid. In the words of a PhD thesis that I think came out of KTH University, to ramble, linger, and gaze. I love that title of, I want to read that thesis. It sounds wonderful. I want to ramble and linger and gaze. Anastasia spoke about the right to mobility and the right to access, as well as the right to safety, but also about the hypermobility sometimes of trying to balance childcare and elder care and work and study and housework. And really, one of the wonderful things about this conference has been that it takes place in a city where it's easier. It's easier to do some of the things in some of the cities we've been talking about because the places where we work and we study are relatively well connected by transport and the ability to walk and the ability to cycle, which doesn't mean that Stockholm's perfect. We've heard some things not so great about Stockholm, but it does point to some larger planning issues and also about a co-benefits approach, because it's not just about safer for women, safer for everyone, it's also safer equals more accessible, equals more environmentally sustainable, equals perhaps less oppressive. Liz, one of the first people who spoke, talked about the differences between the global north and south. And that's a wonderful thing that's changed in 30 years. It was very much a global north movement when this work started. In the global north, we still talk about safer streets and parks and public transport. In the global south, as we've heard, we talk about rape and conflict. We talk about a growing number of refugees, which are overwhelmingly being dealt with in the global south. We talk about safety when collecting water and using communal toilets. We still talk about paternalistic approaches, but we're starting to ask, if we have closed-circuit television, who's watching? If we have lighting, are people going to act if they see something? If we go to the police, are the police part of the problem? And I think that that's a conversation that we need to continue to have. One thing that happened 30 years ago that's happening a little bit less now is that there was a big fight all the time between crime prevention through environmental design and social development approaches. And it's still happening a little bit, but thank goodness it's happening a little bit less. So a few of us have been talking about bystander training. So, you know, the transport safety survey that a lot of us are doing, a lot of people said that a bystander saw harassment going on, but kind of looked away or didn't know what to do. I think that there's a lot more that we need to do on what to do when you see harassment happening. We need to find out more about what's in the minds of harassers. I actually think that Mahesh is doing really brave and really important work. We need to talk about male-on-male violence, including sexual violence against gay and bisexual and transsexual men. That came out a lot in the safety survey we just did in Melbourne. We need to talk about artistic messaging in public space, which has been talked about by a number of people. We need to talk about making places safer, but we also need to create safe spaces. The question of where we can report to, are they actually going to respond? Are they going to be so overwhelmed by the numbers that we flash up? You know, is there actually going to be response? Is there going to be justice? We need to talk about where we can tell our stories, how we can be more effective as scholars and also as activists. And as Juma said, how can scholars and governments and activists work together to create change? Because that's how it happens. I want to particularly thank two people, Anastasia, who has what I thought was an absolutely peerless mental Rolodex of just chunk, 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 here's some people I'm going to bring in, until I met Vanya, who has also an absolutely peerless mental Rolodex of, you're in, this is how you're going to do it, this is how we're going to communicate. I love people like that. So it's been fantastic to be part of this 15-city survey and do peer learning and learn about some cultural differences, but also more similarities, but also to build collective strength. If we collectively knock on the door of transit authorities and police and universities and know that we have a bunch of women and men who have our back in terms of researchers, then that's going to make our research all the more powerful. So victimization and fear are global issues, they're gender issues, but they're also affected by age and ability and racism and homophobia. And I want to end with a slight variant on the Margaret Mead quote, which is, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed pracademics can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Thank you.
Okay, I didn't think you'd be able to sum up the conference, but you seem to do that quite well. So just at the end, we've got our wonderful organizer, Vanya, just to give some closing remarks.
Let's see. Oh, no, it's not. Anyway. Oh, it is. I think it was not. Okay. Yes, so my role here is the easiest one, right? It's just like sit and listen and people, I mean, I think Caroline has done the most impressive job just to summarize so many ideas that is not such a wonderful way. Thank you very much. I have put so many ideas here, but I don't know exactly how I would actually express this in less than 3 minutes. So I think it's better that I just try to connect everything by just saying what motivates me to put this conference together. Normally we have been organizing conferences since 2008, and the first one actually, Anastasia was here. But this, for this conference, the motivation was slightly different, and I think it's connected quite a lot with Elahe mentioned in your comment. I agree completely. We probably should be talking more about the good forces, like what Ida's mother said yesterday. She had such a good message, right? Honestly, the decision of making a conference like this comes from Ida's case, but it expresses a number of many unmentioned names and people that maybe we know, and some people that we don't know and have been there. We, as researchers, we were commenting, discussing about that. We identify areas that we find relevant, and these ones, regardless if you have been a victim or not, it is actually completely relevant. We do think that this is something very important to take on and to work on it, and this is our job. Honestly, the ideas and the case that we heard yesterday from Ida really makes a difference on why we try why we are here. But I do think, I agree with Elahe, maybe there are so many important examples that are out there. And so this is just, I guess, the start of what we probably will continue doing in the future. I have a couple of, here, right? Apart from that, I think I have to say a lot of thanks for all the amazing speakers that we had in these 2 days. And I would like to ask you a big applause for all of them, please. The ones that beautifully put focus on issues of crime in place, crime and environment, other issues related to issues that are important for us to take forward. In the parallel sessions, the scope was much wider, and I think we allowed for that, because I think it would be not nice to just cut the subject into specific. I actually wish that we would have much more representatives of LGBTQI, but it is a challenge to actually find out all, the kinds of, the palette that you would wish. But I think that we end up with a very good sample of research and examples from practice that can take us to think forward. So I am very grateful for that. Honestly, we wouldn't be here without our sponsors that made possible the conference, and the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention BRÅ. I have to read it because it's much easier in Swedish, but in English you have to like read every single word. It feels like. I'm sorry for that, but apart from that, which I think is also important, all the support that I got from my own department in the Division of Urban and Regional Studies, and the ones that also kept us fed and make sure that we had rooms to be with in. The Center for Sustainable Built Environment, CHS, and the Center for Future of Places. The program also was essential with our, what's called triqueria. I don't know what the name in English actually, but which put together the program. And what else? Of course, all the people that directly, indirectly helped me, and I have to spell out the names of the closest people that helped a lot to put together every single, comma, and making sure that things were there. And some of the things were not, just because we fail. So I'm sorry for that, and apologies for the things that didn't work, but we tried our best. My team, Roya Bamsar, Gustavo Moreira, Fatima Dastageb, Runa Bjornsdotter, Susan Hellström, Brigitta Costa, and also I think it's Sandra I'm sorry. Volunteers also, my students, Christine Bull, Therese Wangstrup, and Linda Langfors. A big applause for all of them. And again, I think I will finish with this picture, which was my big motivation to put the conference. I think she is the reminder of what we do, why we are here. And honestly, sometimes I can be just behind my tables, my models, but honestly, we should, it's the case like Ida that make us to put everything in perspective and to think about what basically Juma mentioned, the need of couple up research and practice, which is the essence of the network Safe Places. With that, I think all the audience, that has been wonderful. Thank you very much.
Job.
Yeah, thank you.
It went so well. Everything went well.